This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
According to the World Health Organization 2021 report on hearing, Africa is likely to see the highest percentage increase in numbers of people with hearing loss. The WHO also estimates that globally, 1 in 4 people will be affected by some form of hearing loss in the next few decades. The International Week of the Deaf 2021 was celebrated in the last week of September. This year's theme is celebrating thriving deaf communities and has been set aside to highlight the endurance of the deaf people around the world. On this week's show, we look at some of the causes of hearing loss, challenges faced by the deaf community, and ways they can be addressed. I am Liu Feifei. Welcome to Talk Africa. Despite being a challenge for many in Africa today, hearing loss for some individuals is something they have overcome and have not allowed their disability to be a hindrance. Before we begin our discussion, we caught up with Joseph Etien to tell us more about his life and some of his achievements. Joining me now is Joseph Etien. He's hearing impaired, together with sign language interpreter Judy Kihumba. Hello. Hi guys, thank you so much for joining us. Joseph, let me start by asking you, were you born deaf or did you develop your hearing impairment later in life?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I was born hearing, but I had a nerve system problem which developed with time and worsened, and I became deaf at age 14. I was still in primary school where I learned sign language. And again, I also continued to high school and went to college where all through I learned in sign language. And now I work with a Liverpool Voluntary Counseling Center.
It must have been quite challenging growing up with a hearing impairment. Can you tell us what childhood was like for you?
Before I learned sign language, it was very hard for me how to express myself, how to communicate with other people. Of course, because I had grown up as a hearing child, and here all of a sudden I have changed and I would see deaf people signing. I couldn't fit in the hearing world and in the deaf world. I was just a silent child. I almost killed myself. I was feeling hopeless. I was feeling like life was meaningless. But later I accepted myself and moved on.
And how did that affect your relationship with your parents and in the family, your other siblings?
This time, when I became deaf, my family members were feeling discouraged. They were very discouraged. They were not seeing me like I was a hopeful person. Especially because of communication, it was very hard for me to communicate with them. I would see them talking, but I was never encouraged to talk to them. I was never encouraged. I was feeling like a changed person. I would feel like I had no opportunities because now I couldn't communicate and express myself. But I kept meeting with deaf people here and there who helped me develop the sign language. And in this way, my parents were forcing me to speak because they were thinking I'm pretending. And here I couldn't understand because they were not using sign language.
So how did you overcome all of these challenges?
Yes, I would say when I went to school, and learned sign language and focused myself, I saw myself positive. In fact, I buried myself in books so that I could achieve. I really wanted to, in future, to get a job so that I can show them that yes, I can. I am deaf, yes, but I can. And I can succeed in life. I can become an important person.
And now you actually have a very interesting job. Tell us about what you do.
Yes, it's true. I love my job very much. I work in a Liverpool Voluntary Counseling and Testing Center, where I encourage people and support people. I meet different people, hearing and the deaf people and other disabilities. They all come to me and I interact with them. And I continue still training. I work with them, and I have learned how to work with people with professions. I am a student at Washington University also, where I'm studying leadership and health management.
Now, this week is the International Week of the Deaf. What would you like to say to raise awareness to our audience about people who are living with this hearing impairment?
I would encourage people out there that in this International Deaf Awareness Week, please, when you see a deaf person, don't ignore them. Don't ignore them. Try to learn them because they have hope, and give them hope, and give them the opportunities where they need. Some of you parents, please encourage your children and also learn sign language, so that this is our human rights as deaf people. Try to learn sign language and take care of the deaf people so that they can grow as other children, because the deaf people can do what everyone else can do.
Joseph, you are a true inspiration. Thank you, and thank you, Judy. Thank you both. Now I have learned the sign language. Thank you.
Thank you also.
Joining me now to look closer at the importance of the International Week of the Deaf are from Johannesburg, Andiswa Gabashe. She is the child of a deaf adult and also a sign language interpreter. From Geneva, we have Dr. Shelley Cheda, Technical Officer for Prevention of Deafness and Hearing Loss at the World Health Organization. And from Accra, we're joined by Clement Sam. He's the President of the National Association of Sign Language Interpreters in Ghana. Welcome to the program. Clement, let me begin with you. What we're seeing is a steady rise in the number of people with hearing loss across the world. Is this the case, and what are the contributing factors to this?
Well, that is very true, and the causes are so many, but here in Africa and specifically in Ghana, we've identified that the causes of hearing loss, apart from the congenital ones, we have accidents and wrong diagnoses and wrong medications, and these are the three that in Ghana is causing a lot of issues when it comes to hearing loss and people who are losing their hearing. So yes, basically that is the situation, a proper overview of the condition here in Accra, Ghana. Because a person goes to the hospital and the proper medical attention is not given to the person, and person is misdiagnosed and given the wrong medication. You go home, you take this medication, as a result of the side effects, then you start losing your ears, your hearing, as it were. So in a couple of years, then you become, profoundly deaf.
Dr. Chada, what are your thoughts about this? The WHO has estimated that the prevalence of hearing loss in sub-Saharan Africa will continue to rise and rise considerably in the decades to come. What is causing this? This is consistent with what Clement has said. And also I want to know, is it the same here in sub-Saharan Africa versus perhaps the global north?
Yes, certainly. The number of people who have hearing loss is consistently, it has been rising, and it is projected that this will continue to rise significantly in the coming decades unless we take some public health action to stem this rise. So, and this, as you rightly mentioned, the increase is possibly going to be the largest in sub-Saharan Africa, where the numbers of people who live with hearing loss may rise from a current number of about 137 million people to, I think, nearly 350 million by 2050. But what is also contributing to this are the persistence of risk factors. What Clement just said, all of these risk factors, whether it is, use of certain medicines which are harmful to ears, or it is the fact that there are ear infections are rampant in many parts of the world, including in sub-Saharan Africa. These are infections which can be treated, which can be prevented. Another risk factor which I must highlight here is exposure to loud sounds. So exposure to noise, whether in workplace, but also increasingly in recreational settings. You see the use of headphones increasing across the world, as well as listening to loud sounds, loud music in clubs and discos. So this is also on the rise and is posing a huge threat to the hearing loss.
And Diswa, your father is deaf. Would you mind to share with us, from a personal perspective, what are some of the challenges that he faces as a deaf person?
Because you are born into this family and you do not know anything other except what you're born into. So it's almost a normal family setup. Well, it is a normal setup. And the challenges that I started seeing for my father was when I was a teenager, when I had to go with him to a particular government office because there aren't sign language interpreters there. And then I had to interpret for him. And if I'm going to a church place or anywhere else where there wasn't accessibility to information, to basic information, that if he was hearing, he would have gotten. Or if there was a provision of sign language interpreters, then my father would have acquired that information. So those are the challenges. But my father was very fortunate because he comes from a family where his parents could afford to take him to school. And you can understand at that time, because my father is in his late 60s, and this was the era of apartheid in South Africa at that time. So he was very fortunate that he came from that background, that it was not all dark and gloomy, that they could not afford to take him to school, even though it was not at a level where a hearing school was, or a white person or a non-black person would have had the same opportunities. But he was privileged compared to other deaf people that I know.
Now, it's interesting, Andiswa, you've already touched on education as one of the key challenges. Another challenge that we are aware of is finding employment. Clement, from your perspective over there in Ghana, do you see people with hearing loss or who are clinically deaf, are they being able to integrate into society and take on different roles?
In Ghana here, it's been very difficult, and that is has been the goal of the Deaf Association and relevant stakeholders in trying to push for the inclusion of deaf people, especially when it comes to employment. And most of the deaf people in Ghana, they work in the factories, and the role they play there is factory hand. And when we talk about factory hand in Ghana, it means they assist with day-to-day activities in the factory. They work in the production hub, and they do all those things. But to rise to be in a managerial position, that has been very difficult for them. And those who are able to access education to the university level, when they finish, the best they could become is teachers. They go back to the deaf schools to teach. They cannot teach in hearing schools. So the opportunities for employment are limited when it comes to deaf community in Ghana. However, those who have excelled and have become, they've taken other fields, like those who are lawyers, they will try to work with a firm, or they will try to become advocates by getting their own firm or a small, firm to run, and they'll be championing the cause of disability issues, especially the deaf issues. But the vast majority, either you go into vocation, or you go to the classroom to teach other deaf people at the high school level or senior high school level. So these are the only opportunities for deaf people and hard of hearings in my country, Ghana.
So, Andiswa, what we're hearing is that being deaf is definitely does not prohibit people being very productive members of society. Now, in your experience, what other roles have you seen them succeed and excel at?
Most definitely, I can echo Clemence's words. It's just that it's on us as hearing people to almost unlearn that just because they use sign language, it means they are not able to function as just and normal people. Because there is nothing wrong, and there isn't anything that deaf people can't do that you and I can do. We have deaf producers, finally in South Africa, we have a deaf lawyer. We can be proud and say we have a deaf lawyer who's only one so far. But the change is slowly coming there. But in South Africa, the biggest challenge is that South African Sign Language is not an official language. So we are operating from a language that does not have an official status yet, which then causes a lot of problems, because how do you then fight for linguistical right? How do you then fight for taking up spaces where your language is not recognized as an official language? It's recognized in schools, yes, as a subject, but it's not recognized, which then would cause a hearing person like me who's ignorant, who will think, oh, I can't hire a deaf person. How will they do the work? And then hearing people just go in a panic when there's going to be a deaf person in the room. They're like, oh, what are we going to do? How do you communicate with them? Just chill. They just use a different language from you and I. Yes.
On that note, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we'll have more on our discussion about hearing loss. Don't go away. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Still with me are Andiswa Gabeshe, Dr. Shelly Cheda, and Clement Sam. Now, before the break, we looked at the impact of hearing loss and what it's had on people around Africa. Let's now look at some ways that members of the deaf community have overcome these challenges. Clement, let me start with you. Now, in part one, we've looked at issues that they've had with social integration, education, and of course, employment. Now, I want to ask you, what mechanisms are in place to provide people from the deaf community with some support?
A few days ago, the Vice President of the World Federation of the Deaf, Caspar Bergman, was in Ghana to use himself and a few other deaf people who have excelled, in the field of education and employment as a case to push for the employment and accessibility of deaf people, more of inclusion in our society. And I think it went really well. And, the meetings brought to the attention of stakeholders that, look, apart from when it comes to communication, the deaf person can do basically everything we can do as well. So let's give them the opportunity, and they are going to really, deliver like any other hearing person. And those who have taken up the challenge to employ a deaf person, we've got Vodafone Ghana, they've employed a few deaf people. MTN Ghana, they have a few deaf people they are working with, and it is working amazingly well. Yes, we've identified so many challenges. However, there are improvements these days, and we are trying to close the gap and encouraging deaf people to go into other areas and, like administration, other areas like working in government institutions. Because, look, once you apply for it, there are opportunities, there are organizations who are ready to fight your case.
Dr. Chada, what about the United Nations? What role does the United Nations play in terms of providing assistance to people with hearing loss?
So the World Health Organization that I'm speaking on behalf of, that is the public health agency of the United Nations. And our work really pertains to developing ear and hearing care systems in countries. So what we do is we work with countries, that is ministries of health, in order to integrate strategies for ear and hearing care within the national health plans, for universal health coverage. So the idea is that everybody, irrespective of their financial status, their geographical location, should be able to access services for ear and hearing care. And then is important when hearing loss occurs to be able to identify it at the earliest. So the World Health Organization also develops those technical resources so that countries have clear guidance, also clear tools in order to help people identify hearing loss at the earliest. For example, just to give you an example, we have launched a free application which anybody in the world can download and use to check their hearing status and to monitor it over time. So this is a simple tool anybody can use.
And Diswa, I believe you also touched on earlier. Tell us, why is sign language seen as such a fundamental issue for the deaf community?
For me, it's my home language. As much as I'm hearing, it is my home language. So not being able to function in your home language freely is a discrimination to my basic human rights.
Right.
And for deaf South Africans, and I don't speak for deaf South Africans, by the way, it's just a reference of my father and the lifestyle I'm exposed to. For when it's not recognized and it's not seen as important, then we have challenges where deaf people are only doing the blue collar work, where they can only be gardeners, where they can only be plumbers, where they can only be helpers, where they are not able to hold higher position in society or be seen as a community that can actually add into the economy of the country. So, which is why a language is very important, because language goes with culture and with the history where we come from. When that is taken away or it's not recognized, it is being discriminated against. It's just a basic linguistical right that should be recognized, as much as our panelists have also stated, that there are so many things that each country and the world and us as a society, everybody is doing. And it's not a deaf people issue, it's not a coder issue, it's an all of us. Because if I fight for your human right, I'm indirectly fighting for my human right.
Well,
Well,
definitely
if I
they
can
need
add
to
up
be.
a little bit.
Okay.
Well, and this one we talked about, culture, and it's a way of life, and everybody has the right to a language, and if you look at the deaf culture, sign language is native to them. It's an integral part of their development and way of life. Therefore, if that is deprived of them, it becomes very difficult for them also to develop as as a society. I met one deaf person, and he went to the hospital and they did not have any interpreter. So he called me up to come over. So when I got there, he said, okay, I'm going to tell the doctor something. Please let him know. I said, fine, go ahead. And he said, doctor, good morning. And he responded. He said, do you know what? Initially, I told you we needed a sign language interpreter. And said, yeah, you said. And this man came. Good. And said, but do you know what again? That I do not need a sign language interpreter, but you do? I said, what do you mean? I said, I'm deaf. I use sign language. But you are not deaf. You don't know sign language, but you can learn sign language. I cannot learn how to hear again because I've lost it. That was profound to me. And it got the doctor thinking that, okay, if he knew basic sign language, he could have communicated with this gentleman without me coming in. There are confidential issues they can talk about without getting me involved. Sometimes people need their privacy. Interpreters have become so-called a nuisance in the life of deaf people because we get to know everything they do. It shouldn't be so. They should have their privacy. They should have the right to a language. And it is their native language. Therefore, whatever we do for them, we should get them involved, especially when it involves their language, sign language. And I totally agree with Andy Sua on that tangent.
Dr. Chada, what do you think are necessary in terms of policies and legislations here in Africa to make life better for the deaf community?
it's important that we take a holistic view to ear and hearing care and develop those policies and implement them through the national health systems, through the national social care systems, so that people who are deaf and who have hearing loss, and also people who are at risk of hearing loss, they have the services which are required at all levels, at primary level, close to their homes, at secondary level, at tertiary levels. It's important here also to consider that this is, while the World Health Organization, of course, focuses on the health aspect, it is really not simply a health issue. It's a much broader issue. It touches, as we've already said, on education, on employment, on social rights, and on basic human rights. So a child who is deaf needs care, he needs rehabilitation, needs access to sign language also to be able to gain education. So all these are very, very interrelated. So it's a complex issue. And I think, as Ndiswa had said, it would be really great to get a panel of people who have hearing loss and also parents of deaf children to really debate on this and to discuss this, perhaps next year round.
Perhaps indeed. And Ndiswa, I have time for one last question. Now, for those of us who are not deaf, I want to know, what can we do? How can we interact with the members of the deaf community so that we can bring them in to lean in with us and not to marginalize them?
Ooh, that's a huge question.
Huge, yeah.
And I'm being trusted with that question. Wow, Fifi. There's one is to learn basic sign language, and there are different sign languages because each country has its own sign language, and I think let's just be open-minded. You know, let's take baby steps. Let's be open-minded and not fear that because you are different, or because when we travel and we go to different countries, I don't fear you because you have a different culture or you speak a different language from me. So I think we just need to renew our mind and unlearn a lot of things as hearing people so that we are able to live together in unity. And it starts with you, it starts with me. It starts with this conversation. It starts by the news channels to invite us and have these open talks, and then extend it to the larger community. And just learn a simple hello, how are you? An international sign, which is recognized everywhere, which means I love you, I care. So just small things. And just to see, it's so amazing to be seen as a person. And I think as a society, as the world, we all have the need to be seen. So it's no different for my deaf father wanting or yearning to be seen by the next human being.
And on that note, that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to all of our guests. Ndiswa Gabishe, who's a child of a deaf adult and also a sign language interpreter in South Africa. Dr. Shelley Chada, who's a technical director for prevention of deafness and hearing loss at the World Health Organization. And Clement Sam, who is the president of the National Association of Sign Language Interpreters in Ghana. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch this show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more of Talk Africa. From me, Liu Feifei, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, stay safe and goodbye.